So apparently, my HOA thought my backyard was the perfect venue for their president's daughter's wedding, and they forgot one tiny detail, asking me. I'm coming home from a 2-week work trip, exhausted and ready to collapse in my own space, when I turn the corner and see industrial-grade tent stakes driven straight through my grandfather's prize-winning rose garden. The diesel fumes from 3 generator trucks are choking the air, and there's a catering crew treating me like I'm the one trespassing on my own property. The sound of metal tent poles scraping against my house siding is like nails on a chalkboard, and I can smell the sweet scent of my trampled jasmine bushes mixing with muddy tire tracks across my freshly seeded lawn. Then Karen Whitmore, our lovely HOA president, strolls over with this smug little wave and some paperwork about a community use clause. What would you do if you came home to this nightmare? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I need to know. I'm not alone in this insanity. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mess. I'm David Chen, and I inherited my grandfather's 1,940 Craftsman home in Willowbrook Estates about 6 months ago. This wasn't just any house. It was where I spent every summer as a kid, learning to tend his legendary rose garden and listening to his stories about standing up to neighborhood bullies. I work as a freelance software consultant, mostly from home, and honestly, I thought moving to the suburbs would be peaceful, quiet street, mature trees, the kind of place where your biggest worry is remembering to put the trash cans out on Tuesday. Boy, was I wrong. Enter Karen Whitmore, our 52-year-old HOA president who's been running unopposed for 8 years. Picture the most stereotypical Karen you can imagine, then multiply her entitlement by 10. She's married to a city councilman, drives a white BMW with personalized plates that say HOA boss, and has this way of looking at you like you're something unpleasant she stepped in. Karen has a talent for selective rule enforcement that would make a corrupt politician proud. Take Mr. Patel, the sweet elderly man 3 houses down. Karen hit him with violation notices for his ethnic garden statues. They were traditional Indian brass peacocks that had been there for 15 years. Then there was the young black family, the Johnstons, who got harassed constantly about their kid's basketball hoop until they finally took it down just to get some peace. My first taste of Karen's special brand of justice came 2 weeks after I moved in. A violation notice appeared on my door. Apparently my mailbox was the wrong shade of white. I kid you not, she had a color chart. When I politely questioned whether dove white versus pearl white really mattered, the $50 fine magically became $200. That was just the beginning. My grass was too long at 3.1 inches when the limit was 3 inches flat. My Halloween decorations remained up past November 1st, even though I'd taken them down on Halloween night. She complained about my work van parked in my own driveway, saying it gave the neighborhood a commercial appearance. The pattern was obvious. Every time I pushed back on one of her ridiculous violations, she'd find something new to complain about. It was like living under a microscope operated by someone who genuinely didn't want me there. But here's where it gets interesting. Buried on page 47 of our HOA covenant, and trust me, nobody reads to page 47, there's something called a community use clause. It was originally written for emergencies, like if someone needed to use a neighbor's yard during a natural disaster, or for block parties with everyone's consent. Karen, being the creative interpreter of rules that she is, decided this clause meant she could declare any community benefit event fair game for using private property. And apparently, her daughter Madison's happiness was such a tremendous benefit to our community that my backyard became the perfect wedding venue. The really infuriating part? I found out later that Karen had already charged Madison's future in-laws $8,000 as a venue fee. That money went straight into something called the HOA Special Events Fund, which was really just Karen's personal slush fund that nobody else knew existed. So there I was, standing in my own driveway, breathing diesel fumes and watching strangers destroy 3 generations of careful gardening, while Karen waved her paperwork around like she owned the place. The metallic taste of pure rage was building in my mouth. But I knew getting angry wouldn't solve anything. I needed to get smart, fast. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal notice taped to my door, not tucked in the mailbox like a normal person would do, but taped right there for all the neighbors to see. Community event scheduled, it announced in Karen's perfectly formatted HOA letterhead. 200 guests. Full wedding reception. This coming Saturday. Professional vendors already contracted, deposits paid, and get this. Karen's justification was that Madison's happiness benefits the entire community. I'm not making this up. I called an emergency HOA meeting faster than you can say property rights violation. The community center that night was packed, but not in the way I'd hoped. Karen had rallied her usual supporters, what I'd started calling the Tuesday morning coffee clatch, and they were lined up like a defensive wall around her. I walked in with my property deed printed out and highlighted, ready to challenge this insane interpretation of the community use clause. The fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and Karen's vanilla perfume was so overpowering I could taste it from 3 rows back. My pen was doing this nervous tap, tap, tap against my clipboard because honestly, I was terrified. But I stood up anyway. Karen, I brought my property deed tonight because I think there's been a misunderstanding about what constitutes community use. She didn't even look up from her perfectly organized binder. The covenant is clear, dear. Perhaps you should have read it more carefully before moving here. Dear, like I was some confused child who couldn't understand grown-up rules. That's when I discovered the first mini twist in this whole mess. After the meeting, I was walking to my car when Mrs. Rodriguez from down the street grabbed my arm. David, honey, you need to know something, she whispered, glancing around like we were planning espionage. Karen charged Madison's in-laws $8,000 for your backyard. $80,000. I drove home in a daze, my brain trying to process this information. Karen wasn't just using my property without permission, she was profiting from it, big time. And here's the kicker. None of the other residents knew about this fee or about the mysterious HOA Special Events Fund where that money had disappeared. That night, I became best friends with Google. I learned more about property rights and HOA limitations than I ever wanted to know. The musty smell of my grandfather's old law books mixed with fresh coffee as I researched until 3 a.m. Here's what I discovered. HOAs cannot use emergency clauses for personal profit. Period. If they're making money off your property, they've crossed the line from community management into commercial exploitation. That's your first legal takeaway. Write it down. I found cases just like mine, precedents that said unreasonable community use was absolutely challengeable in court, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I called a property law attorney for a free consultation. But Karen wasn't done with me yet. Oh no. The next morning, I woke up to another violation notice. This time, excessive outdoor lighting. She was citing me for my porch light, the same porch light that had been there for 30 years that helped elderly Mr. Patel see his way home from his evening walks, that literally every house on the block had an identical version of. Then came the threatening letter about disrupting community harmony, as if I was the one causing problems by objecting to having my property stolen. But the real gut punch was what happened next. I started hearing whispers at the grocery store, seeing neighbors cross the street to avoid talking to me. Karen had launched a quiet but effective rumor campaign. Suddenly, I was difficult. I didn't understand neighborhood values. I was that troublemaker who couldn't just go along to get along. The sound of my own footsteps echoing in the cereal aisle had never felt so lonely. I realized Karen wasn't just fighting me over a wedding venue, she was trying to isolate me completely, make me so miserable that I'd either comply or move away entirely. Standing there between the Cheerios and the granola bars, clutching my shopping list and fighting back anger, I made a decision. I wasn't going anywhere. This was my grandfather's house, my sanctuary, my home. If Karen wanted to fight, she was going to get one. But I was going to play by rules she'd never expect. Karen decided to bring in the big guns. 2 days later, a city inspector showed up at my door. Turns out he was Karen's golf buddy, because of course he was. They'd found unpermitted modifications to cite me for, specifically my grandfather's 30-year-old workshop shed that had been there since before Karen even moved to the neighborhood. This inspector went through my property like he was hunting for buried treasure. Foundation issues with the front steps, electrical concerns about outdoor outlets that had passed 3 previous inspections, structural questions about a pergola that had survived 2 decades of storms without so much as a loose board. $2,500 in threatened fines, 30-day compliance deadline, and then Karen showed up at my door that evening with her signature smug smile. Still think fighting the HOA is worth it, dear. I wanted to slam the door in her face. Instead, I smiled right back and said, absolutely. The next morning, I hired Jake Morrison, a local attorney who specializes in HOA disputes. His office smelled like stale coffee and determination, and when I explained my situation, he started grinning like Christmas had come early. David, he said, scratching notes on his legal pad with sharp, confident strokes, Karen just made a very expensive mistake. Community use clauses are tricky, but when there's a profit motive involved, they become legally void. HOAs, acting as commercial entities, lose their protected status. That's your second legal takeaway, and it's a big one. Jake filed a formal legal challenge and demanded Karen produce all financial records related to the Special Events Fund. But here's where things got really interesting. While Jake was handling the legal warfare, I was doing my own detective work. I had ordered a title insurance research report, something most people never think to do, and what I found was absolutely mind-blowing. My property was never legally incorporated into the HOA boundaries. Let me say that again. I was never actually in the HOA. The original 1987 subdivision plat had excluded my lot due to a separate water easement that ran through the property. My grandfather had never signed the HOA covenant because he was never required to. All of Karen's violations, all of her threats, all of her power plays, completely meaningless. I wasn't even technically a member of the organization that had been tormenting me for months. Jake's reaction when I showed him the documents was priceless. He actually laughed out loud and said Karen's about to have a very bad day. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. When she realized her legal position was crumbling, she got desperate. And desperate Karen was somehow even worse than regular Karen. She tried to block my mailbox access, which is a federal crime, by the way. She organized a neighborhood safety patrol to monitor my visitors, like I was running some kind of criminal enterprise out of my home office. Then she contacted my biggest client and suggested I was mentally unstable and might not be reliable for their upcoming software project. That last one almost worked. I spent a very uncomfortable hour on the phone reassuring a concerned client that no, I was not having a breakdown, and yes, their project was still on schedule. But Karen's desperation had an unexpected side effect. Other neighbors started coming forward. Mr. Patel quietly approached me while I was checking my mail. The crisp sound of fresh legal documents being pulled from my mailbox probably caught his attention. He had his own stack of Karen horror stories, including $3,000 in fines for inappropriate landscaping that looked suspiciously like ethnic discrimination. The Johnstons revealed that Karen's harassment campaign against them had included anonymous complaints to child services about their parenting, all because their kids played basketball in their own driveway. Mrs. Rodriguez showed up at my door with a folder 2 inches thick. Unreasonable fines, threatening letters, violations for things that weren't actually violations. Karen had been systematically bullying half the neighborhood, and everyone had been suffering in silence. That's when I had an idea. What if we all met up, compared notes? Maybe there's strength in numbers. The sweet relief of my central air conditioning never felt better than when 5 of Karen's victims gathered around my kitchen table that evening. We called ourselves the Karen Survivors Support Group, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. We had evidence, we had witnesses, and thanks to my title research, we had the legal high ground. Karen had picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. Karen decided to go nuclear. I woke up Tuesday morning to find a sheriff's deputy at my door, serving me with a restraining order. Karen was claiming I had threatened violence against her and posed a danger to the community. Complete fabrication, but there it was in black and white, with a court date scheduled for Friday, conveniently the day before Saturday's wedding. Her calculation was brilliant in its evil simplicity. If the restraining order held, I'd be legally barred from my own property during the wedding. She could have her perfect venue, and I'd be powerless to stop her. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth as I read the papers. But you know what? I wasn't panicking anymore. I was getting methodical. Jake filed an emergency motion to dismiss and demanded Karen produce evidence of these alleged threats. Here's where my paranoia about security cameras paid off big time. I provided footage from 3 different angles showing every interaction I'd had with Karen over the past month. Not once had I raised my voice, made a threatening gesture, or done anything remotely aggressive. In fact, the videos showed quite the opposite. Karen yelling, pointing fingers, and in one particularly damning clip actually shoving me when I tried to photograph damage to my grandfather's rose garden. We counterfilled harassment charges with an evidence folder that was now approaching 3 inches thick. False restraining orders carry perjury penalties up to 5 years in prison. That's your third legal takeaway, and trust me, Karen's lawyer made sure she understood the implications. But the real bombshell came from Jake's discovery process. When you file legal challenges against HOAs, they're required to open their financial records for examination. And boy, did we find some interesting reading material. Karen hadn't just been embezzling from the Special Events Fund. She'd been systematically stealing from the HOA for years. Vacation to Hawaii charged as community research. Madison's college tuition listed as educational outreach. A new kitchen renovation filed under home office improvements for HOA business. Total theft $45,000 over 3 years. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. When word got out about Karen's financial crimes, her coffee klatch supporters evaporated faster than morning mist. An emergency HOA meeting was called, not by Karen, but by concerned residents who were finally waking up to what had been happening under their noses. Madison Whitmore was devastated. I actually felt sorry for her. Imagine discovering your wedding venue drama was just the tip of an iceberg of your mother's criminal behavior. She tried to cancel the whole thing, but it was too late. Deposits were non-refundable, vendors were contracted, and guests had already made travel arrangements. Karen's final, desperate moves were almost comical if they weren't so destructive. She attempted to bribe the city inspector to condemn my house. He recorded the conversation and turned it over to the police. She spread rumors about my mental health and professional competence that were so outrageous they actually backfired, making her look unhinged instead of me. Then she made the mistake of vandalizing my property. My newly installed security cameras caught her red-handed at 2 a.m. spray painting "Community Destroyer" across my garage door. The crisp night air carried the sharp scent of fresh paint and Karen's desperation as she crept around my property like some suburban ninja. The satisfying click of my camera's motion detection was probably the best sound I'd heard all month. When confronted with video evidence of her late-night artwork, Karen tried to claim she was protecting neighborhood values. The police weren't impressed. She threatened to sue me for defamation over the embezzlement evidence. Apparently pointing out someone's crimes is now considered slander in Karen's world. Her lawyer had to explain that truth is an absolute defense against defamation claims, and suggesting otherwise was just digging her hole deeper. Throughout all this chaos, I maintained my strategy of documented patience. Every threat, every illegal act, every violation of basic human decency was carefully recorded and filed away. I was building a case so airtight that even Karen's connections couldn't save her. But I was also planning something special for wedding day. See, Jake had helped me draft a settlement offer that would give Karen one last chance at redemption. She could use my property for the wedding, but only under very specific conditions that would ensure justice for everyone she'd wronged. The terms were simple: full public apology to all victims, complete financial restitution, immediate resignation from the HOA, and a 5-year ban from any community leadership roles. In exchange, the wedding could proceed and Karen could avoid federal charges for the municipal corruption we'd uncovered. It was more mercy than she deserved, but my grandfather had always taught me that justice without compassion just creates more bullies. Karen had until Saturday morning to decide: sign the settlement or watch her daughter's wedding get bulldozed, literally. Just when I thought this story couldn't get any wilder, Jake called me with news that changed everything. "David, you need to sit down for this one," he said, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. My deeper research into Karen's husband just hit federal jackpot territory. Councilman Robert Whitmore hadn't just been voting on city contracts, he'd been steering them directly to the wedding vendors Karen had hired. The catering company that was setting up in my backyard, they'd received a no-bid contract worth $200,000 for city events. The tent rental company currently destroying my lawn, exclusive provider for all municipal functions. But here's the kicker. That $8,000 venue fee Karen charged Madison's in-laws hadn't just gone into her personal slush fund. It had been laundered through the city's community development account and distributed back to these same vendors as bonus payments. Municipal corruption cases trigger federal jurisdiction with sentences up to 20 years. That's takeaway number 4, and it's a big one. The FBI had been quietly investigating Robert Whitmore for months as part of a larger corruption probe. My little HOA dispute had just handed them the missing piece of their puzzle, documented proof of the kickback scheme they'd been trying to nail down. Federal Agent Patricia Martinez contacted me the next morning. She explained that my evidence could be the linchpin in a federal case that would take down a whole network of corrupt officials. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just a neighborhood bully anymore. She was a federal criminal facing decades in prison. The power dynamic shifted so fast it gave me whiplash. Local media picked up the corruption angle, and Karen's embezzlement became front-page news. Madison's fiancé's family, who were wealthy and well-connected themselves, threatened to cancel the wedding entirely rather than be associated with a federal corruption scandal. I found myself at a moral crossroads that my grandfather's wisdom hadn't quite prepared me for. I could cooperate fully with the FBI and watch Karen's life implode completely, or I could find a middle path that served justice without total destruction. Karen's panic was almost pathetic to watch. She tried desperately to return the stolen HOA funds, claiming everything was just bookkeeping errors. She attempted to throw her husband under the bus, saying she had no idea about the vendor connections. When that didn't work, she actually showed up at my door, crying, begging for understanding between neighbors. For the first time since this whole mess started, I saw vulnerability in her eyes instead of entitlement. Fear for Madison's happiness, terror about losing everything, genuine remorse for the damage she'd caused. "Please," she whispered, standing on my doorstep where she'd delivered so many threatening notices. "Madison doesn't deserve to pay for my mistakes." The community was demanding her immediate resignation. An emergency vote was scheduled for Monday after the wedding weekend. Property values were being threatened by the scandal, and everyone wanted resolution. But something my grandfather once told me kept echoing in my head. Justice isn't about punishment, David. It's about protection and healing. I realized I had the power to destroy Karen completely, or I could use this moment to heal an entire community that had been fractured by her abuse of power. The choice was mine, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I wasn't seeking total destruction, I wanted complete justice, and there's a difference. My plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let the wedding proceed, but entirely on my terms. Transform this personal violation into a community healing moment that would benefit everyone who'd suffered under Karen's reign of terror. Jake helped me craft a settlement agreement so legally bulletproof that even Karen's high-powered attorney couldn't find loopholes. The satisfying weight of properly drafted legal documents felt like holding pure justice in my hands. But I couldn't do this alone. Time to assemble my team. Mr. Patel, retired engineer with 40 years of project management experience, became my logistics coordinator. His methodical approach to planning reminded me why engineers make the best allies. Everything measured twice, executed once. The Johnstons, who were social media savvy millennials, handled documentation and publicity strategy. Their ability to live stream, record, and distribute content in real time would ensure everything was properly witnessed and preserved. Mrs. Rodriguez, a former high school principal, took charge of community outreach and mediation. Her natural authority and diplomatic skills were perfect for managing the emotional complexity of what we were planning. And Jake Morrison anchored our legal framework, ensuring every step stayed within proper bounds while maximizing our enforcement mechanisms. The settlement offer I presented to Karen was fair but non-negotiable. She could use my property for Madison's wedding, but under strict supervision with detailed conditions. She had to publicly apologize to every victim of her harassment campaign and make complete financial restitution, not just to the HOA, but to everyone who had paid unreasonable fines or legal fees fighting her abuse. Most importantly, she had to resign immediately from the HOA and accept a 5-year ban from any community leadership role. In exchange, the wedding would proceed as planned, and the reception proceeds would fund a new community garden on land I'd donate from my property. The technical preparation was extensive. We had professional property surveys confirming my non-HOA status, detailed inventories of all damage with repair cost estimates, and a comprehensive security system upgrade with remote monitoring capabilities. Jake filed a settlement as a legally binding court order, meaning any violation would result in immediate enforcement. Settlement agreements become court orders when properly filed and enforced. That's your 5th legal takeaway. Make sure any deal you strike has real teeth. But here's where things got interesting. I had a backup plan that would make Karen think twice about trying any last-minute sabotage. I rented a bulldozer, not for malicious destruction, but for legal property protection. If Karen violated any settlement terms, I had immediate recourse to clear my property of unauthorized structures. My cousin Tony, who ran a construction company, briefed his crew on various hand signals and timing protocols. The bulldozer would be parked visibly at a construction site just 2 blocks away, close enough that the rumble of its engine test carried on the wind. The psychological effect was exactly what I'd hoped for. Karen kept glancing nervously toward the construction noise every time she came to inspect wedding preparations. The community involvement was perhaps the most satisfying part. Residents organized a neighborhood healing potluck for Sunday after the wedding, creating a positive social event to replace Karen's divisive leadership style. We started fundraising for other victims' legal costs and planned a new HOA election with actual democratic reform. Local news coverage framed the story as community overcomes corruption, focusing on healing and justice rather than just revenge. The narrative was shifting from petty neighborhood drama to a legitimate story about grassroots democracy and standing up to abuse of power. My personal preparation was just as important as the legal strategy. I'd been working with a therapist on boundary setting and stress management, practicing how to stay calm during confrontation while still protecting my rights. My grandfather's wisdom became my mantra: protect the peace, but never enable bullies. The fresh scent of newly printed settlement documents mixed with the mechanical hum of security cameras being installed created an atmosphere of methodical preparation. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about creating systematic change that would protect future victims. Wednesday evening, I hosted one final meeting of our Karen Survivors Support Group. The comforting warmth of supportive neighbors' handshakes around my kitchen table felt like the foundation of something new and better for our community. Everything was in place: legal documents filed, backup plans ready, community support mobilized, and media attention focused on the positive aspects of our story. Karen had until Saturday morning to sign the settlement. If she chose cooperation, Madison would have her dream wedding and our neighborhood would begin healing. If she chose confrontation, well, that bulldozer engine had a very distinctive sound. Karen's desperation reached new heights as Saturday approached. She was like a cornered animal, lashing out in increasingly reckless ways that only made her legal situation worse. Thursday morning, I woke up to no electricity, no water, and no internet. Karen had somehow convinced utility companies to shut off my services, claiming I was no longer a resident of the property. Of course, this was completely illegal. You can't just cancel someone else's utilities because you're having a tantrum. One phone call to Jake, and everything was restored within 2 hours. But the message was clear. Karen was willing to commit multiple felonies just to make my life miserable. Then she started targeting my business directly. I got calls from 3 different clients saying they'd received anonymous tips about my mental health, suggesting I was unstable and might not deliver their software projects on time. One particularly nasty voice message claimed I was having a psychotic break and recommended they find a new developer immediately. The acrid smell of slashed rubber hit me when I walked outside Friday morning. All 4 tires on my work van had been cut, along with the garden hoses, and my mailbox was beaten in with what looked like a baseball bat. But here's where Karen's lack of criminal expertise showed. She'd forgotten about my comprehensive security camera system. Crystal clear footage of her vandalizing my property at 3 a.m., wearing what she probably thought was a clever disguise but was actually just a hoodie that clearly showed her face under the streetlights. Jake filed additional harassment charges before I'd even finished my morning coffee. But Karen wasn't done. She tried to bribe me one last time, showing up at my door with an envelope full of cash. $25,000, she said, hands actually shaking as she held it out. Just disappear for the weekend, take a nice vacation, pretend none of this ever happened. When I refused, she completely lost it, started screaming about how I was destroying property values and ruining an innocent girl's wedding day. The neighbors across the street came out to see what the commotion was about, which only made Karen yell louder about how everyone was conspiring against her. The mini twist came when Robert Whitmore secretly contacted Jake, asking for a private meeting. Karen's husband was ready to throw her under the bus to save his own political career. He offered to testify against Karen's financial crimes and reveal additional corruption if we'd help him get immunity from federal prosecution. Turns out Karen's criminal network was even bigger than we'd realized. Falsified insurance claims, tax evasion, kickback schemes involving multiple city contracts. She'd been running a one-woman corruption empire while pretending to enforce neighborhood standards. The irony was delicious. Karen, who'd spent years terrorizing people for minor rule violations, was herself a serial felon. Friday evening brought the most pathetic attempt yet. Karen tried to have me committed for psychiatric evaluation, calling 911 and claiming I was armed and dangerous and threatening to blow up the wedding. The responding officer took one look at me, calmly working on code in my home office, and Karen's wild-eyed, disheveled appearance, and immediately knew who the real problem was. But the best part was happening quietly in the background. Madison had finally learned the full extent of her mother's crimes and was horrified. She'd threatened to elope rather than have a scandal-tainted wedding, which was Karen's absolute worst nightmare. Losing her daughter's love and respect on top of everything else. Madison actually showed up at my door Friday night, looking exhausted and heartbroken. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I had no idea what she was doing to you, to everyone. If there's any way to make this right." I invited her in for coffee, and we talked for 2 hours about family, expectations, and the difference between loyalty and enabling bad behavior. She was a sweet kid who'd been manipulated by her mother's version of events, and I genuinely felt sorry for her. By Friday night, federal agents had searched search warrants on Karen's house and seized computers, financial records, and boxes of documents. The investigation was accelerating, and Karen faced potential federal charges within weeks. Local media coverage had intensified, with reporters camping out near the neighborhood hoping to catch Karen's next meltdown. The story was going regional, with headlines like HOA Tyrant's Criminal Empire Exposed and Suburban Wedding Becomes Federal Case. The cold metal of my backup door locks felt reassuring as I double-checked security that night. Tomorrow would bring either Karen's signature on the settlement agreement or the most epic property rights showdown in suburban history. Either way, I was ready. Saturday morning arrived with Karen making one final, desperate play that was so outrageous it almost seemed like a parody of itself. She'd somehow convinced a private psychiatric service to show up at my door at 6 a.m., claiming I needed emergency evaluation for violent tendencies. Picture this: I'm in my pajamas, coffee mug in hand, opening the door to 2 very confused mental health professionals who'd been told I was armed and suicidal. The lead psychiatrist took one look at my calm demeanor and Karen lurking behind my fence like some suburban stalker and immediately knew something was off. After a brief conversation where I explained the situation and showed him the legal documents, he actually apologized and warned me that filing false psychiatric reports was a felony. Karen's face when the psychiatrist walked over to lecture her about abuse of emergency services, priceless. Meanwhile, I was putting the finishing touches on my backup plan. Final security system tests confirmed all cameras were recording properly, backup power sources were ready, and every legal document was filed and notarized. The diesel rumble of Tony's Bulldozer doing engine tests 2 blocks away provided the perfect soundtrack to Karen's increasing panic. But Karen's smear campaign reached truly absurd levels that morning. She'd taken out a full-page ad in the local newspaper, and I'm talking about actual money spent on actual newsprint, with the headline, "Dangerous Neighbor Threatens Community Safety." It included a photo of me, taken without permission, and a completely fabricated story about threats and violence. The newspaper's editor called me personally to apologize. Apparently, Karen had paid cash for the ad and claimed it was a public service announcement. They'd already pulled it from the online edition and were printing a retraction for Sunday's paper. Social media was even worse. Karen had created multiple fake accounts to spread rumors about my mental health, professional competence, and alleged criminal background. She'd posted my address with claims I was unstable and dangerous to children. The level of harassment was approaching federal cyberstalking territory. But here's where karma started working in my favor. Madison's fiance's family, the Ashfords, were prominent business leaders with serious money and connections. When they discovered the extent of Karen's behavior, they were absolutely horrified. Mr. Ashford, who owned a chain of luxury hotels, personally contacted me to apologize and offered to pay for all damages, legal fees, and any other costs related to Karen's harassment campaign. Their family reputation was being damaged by association with Karen's crimes, and they wanted to make things right. More importantly, they'd hired their own private investigator who'd uncovered even more evidence of Karen's financial crimes. Bank records showing systematic theft, forged documents, and a pattern of corruption going back over a decade. The federal case was now rock solid, with Karen facing potential indictment on multiple felony charges. Her husband had already resigned from the city council in disgrace, and plea deal negotiations were underway. But the most satisfying moment came when Karen's last remaining supporters, the remnants of her coffee klatch, finally abandoned her completely. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been Karen's closest ally, actually came to my door to apologize and reveal the extent of Karen's manipulation. "She told us you were mentally ill," Mrs. Henderson admitted, wringing her hands nervously. "Said you'd threatened to hurt people, that you were dangerous. We believed her because, well, we trusted her judgment." The pattern was clear. Karen had been systematically lying to everyone, creating false narratives to justify her abuse of power and isolate her victims. By noon Saturday, Karen was completely alone except for reluctant family support. Even Madison had distanced herself, staying at the Ashfords Hotel rather than deal with her mother's escalating breakdown. The tension headache building behind my eyes felt like a barometer of the approaching storm, but as I signed the final legal documents and heard the satisfying click of Jake's pen completing our preparations, I knew we were ready for whatever Karen might try. The clean scent of fresh legal paperwork mixed with the distant diesel rumble of construction equipment created an atmosphere of inevitable justice. Everything was in place, every contingency covered, every backup plan ready. Karen had 1 hour to sign the settlement agreement. After that, the bulldozer would clear my property of all unauthorized structures. The federal investigation would proceed without any mercy deals, and her daughter's wedding would become collateral damage in Karen's war against basic human decency. The choice was entirely hers, but based on her behavior so far, I wasn't optimistic about her making the smart decision. I'm to find out if 3 years of criminal behavior had taught Karen any lessons about consequences. The moment of truth arrived at exactly 1 p.m. Saturday afternoon. I pulled into my own driveway to find Karen directing wedding setup like some kind of delusional event coordinator, barking orders at vendors who kept glancing nervously at the growing crowd of neighbors, reporters, and curious onlookers gathering on the street. When Karen saw me approaching with Jake and our folder of legal documents, she actually tried to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. The responding police officer, who'd been briefed by Jake about the legal situation, patiently explained property rights to Karen, while 200 wedding guests watched in fascination. "Ma'am, he owns this property. You're the one who could be charged with trespassing." The nervous murmur of confused wedding guests created a soundtrack of anticipation as Jake formally served Karen with the final settlement agreement. The terms were read aloud, clear enough for everyone to hear. Public apology, full financial restitution, immediate resignation, 5-year leadership ban. "You have 30 minutes to sign," Jake announced, checking his watch with theatrical precision. "After that, construction equipment will clear all unauthorized structures from this private property." Right on cue, the diesel rumble of Tony's bulldozer grew louder as it approached from the construction site. Karen's face went white as she realized this wasn't a bluff. Madison broke down completely, tears streaming as she begged her mother to sign for the family's sake. "Please, Mom, just sign it. I can't watch you destroy everything we have left." But Karen's pride wouldn't let her surrender. Even facing federal charges, public humiliation, and the complete destruction of her daughter's wedding, she refused to admit wrongdoing. "I've done nothing wrong," she screamed at the assembled crowd. "This is my community, and I've protected our values for 8 years. Some people just don't understand what it takes to maintain standards." That's when the federal agents arrived. Perfect timing, like something out of a movie. 2 black SUVs pulled up just as Karen was ranting about property rights and community values. Agent Martinez stepped out with search warrants and an arrest warrant for Karen's husband, who was already in federal custody. The sharp crack of microphone feedback pierced the air as someone handed me the wedding DJ's microphone. 200 guests, a dozen reporters, and half the neighborhood were watching. Time for my moment. 3 years ago, Karen Whitmore began a systematic campaign of harassment against me and other residents of this community, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned crowd. What started as petty HOA violations escalated into financial crimes, municipal corruption, and federal offenses. I held up the evidence folder thick with documentation. Anyone who wants to examine the facts is welcome to review 3 years of illegal fines, discriminatory enforcement, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The silence was complete except for the diesel rumble of the bulldozer idling nearby. But this isn't about revenge, I continued, looking directly at Karen's shocked face. It's about protection. Protection for Mr. Patel, who was fined for celebrating his heritage. Protection for the Johnstons, who were harassed for letting their children play. Protection for Mrs. Rodriguez and dozens of others who suffered in silence. One by one, Karen's victims stepped forward to share their stories. The pattern of abuse, discrimination, and financial exploitation became undeniable, as witness after witness described years of systematic harassment. Mr. Patel's voice shook as he described $3,000 in illegal fines. The Johnstons revealed anonymous complaints to child services. Mrs. Rodriguez showed her folder of threatening letters. A dozen other residents came forward with similar stories. The media captured everything, streaming live as Karen's reign of terror was exposed before the entire community. Agent Martinez approached with handcuffs as Karen finally understood the full scope of her legal jeopardy. Federal charges, state charges, civil lawsuits, and complete public disgrace. That's when Madison did something that surprised everyone. She physically took the pen from her mother's shaking hand and held it out. "Sign it, Mom, please. For me, for our family, for what's left of your soul." The scratch of pen on settlement documents was audible in the complete silence. Karen signed with tears streaming down her face, her signature sealing her public apology, financial restitution, and permanent banishment from community leadership. The crowd erupted in applause. Not cruel celebration, but relief that justice had finally been served. As federal agents led Karen away in handcuffs, she looked back at the wedding setup that would now proceed under my supervision. Madison's big day would be saved, but it would forever be remembered as the day her mother's criminal empire collapsed. I handed the microphone back to the DJ and said the words that would define this moment. Justice isn't revenge, it's protection. The wedding reception that evening became something none of us expected, an impromptu community celebration of justice and healing. Madison's ceremony proceeded beautifully despite the chaos. The Ashford family stepped up magnificently, transforming what could have been a disaster into a genuinely joyful event. And you know what? I donated all the leftover food to the local homeless shelter, because that's what my grandfather would have done. Karen began her court-ordered community service the following week, working at the senior center where she had to face some of the elderly residents she'd terrorized with unreasonable fines. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Mr. Patel, who made a point of visiting regularly to check on her rehabilitation. 6 months later, our neighborhood looked completely different, and I'm not just talking about the physical improvements. Mr. Patel was elected as our new HOA president, with Mrs. Rodriguez as secretary. Their first official act was removing every discriminatory covenant and rewriting the community use clause to require actual consent from property owners. Imagine that, asking permission before using someone's backyard for a wedding. The memorial garden we created on my donated land became a beautiful tribute to my grandfather's memory and a symbol of community healing. Every resident contributed something, plants, labor, or funds, and it quickly became the neighborhood's favorite gathering spot. Property values not only recovered from the scandal but actually increased as word spread about our reformed, democratic HOA. Apparently, people are willing to pay more to live somewhere that doesn't tolerate bullies. The Community Justice Scholarship we established with settlement money has already changed lives. Our first recipient was the Johnston's daughter, who's studying civil rights law and dreams of protecting other families from housing discrimination. She sends me updates from college, and her passion for justice reminds me why this fight was worth it. My business thrived after the media attention, but in the best possible way. I now specialize in developing software for small nonprofits and advocacy organizations, using my programming skills to help other underdogs fight their own battles against corrupt systems. Jake Morrison became the go-to attorney for HOA disputes throughout the region, and we maintain a referral partnership that's helped dozens of other Karen victims find justice. As for Karen herself, she completed her community service and paid full restitution to everyone she'd wronged. The federal charges were reduced in exchange for her cooperation in the broader corruption investigation, which ultimately led to reforms in city contracting procedures. Madison's marriage is thriving, and she's slowly rebuilding her relationship with her mother. Karen sent me a handwritten apology letter after completing court-ordered therapy. And while I can't say we're friends, there's something resembling mutual respect now. The sweet fragrance of my grandfather's roses in full bloom reminds me every morning that justice, like gardening, requires patience, persistence, and the belief that beautiful things can grow from difficult soil. Our neighborhood now hosts monthly community coffee meetings that actually include the whole community, not just Karen's former inner circle. We tackle problems together, make decisions democratically, and haven't had a single discrimination complaint since the new leadership took over. Looking back, I realized this story was never really about a wedding or an HOA dispute. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being pushed around and choose to fight back with intelligence, persistence, and just enough righteous anger to fuel real change. My grandfather always said, "Stand firm in kindness, but never enable cruelty." It took a bulldozer and federal agents to fully understand what he meant, but the lesson was worth learning. Today, I'm proud to live in a community where people look out for each other instead of looking for reasons to tear each other down, where differences are celebrated instead of cited, where leadership serves the community instead of exploiting it. And every time I smell diesel fumes or hear construction equipment, I smile and remember the day justice rolled up on treads. So here's my challenge to you. Share your own HOA nightmare in the comments below. Trust me, you're not alone in this fight. These bullies count on our silence and isolation, but together we're unstoppable. And if this story inspired you to believe that ordinary people can create extraordinary change, hit that subscribe button. Next week, I'm telling you about the time I caught my neighbor stealing packages and got them arrested. Spoiler alert, it involves a glitter bomb and very confused police officers. Remember, bullies count on your silence and isolation. Document everything, know your rights, and never let anyone make you feel small in your own home.